much, Professor Patnaik. Exactly on time, as usual. And now it is Professor Ashish Nandi's turn.
I must start by admitting that I came to know of this conference and that I have to talk here only at 11 o'clock this morning. And I had something to do exactly at that point of time. So I couldn't actually spend even 5 minutes to think about what I am going to say. I never received the invitation either. She sent me the invitation through WhatsApp. I never see it.
By email. I called you.
I called me in the morning when I was always half sleepy at 9 o'clock. I wake up at 9, work till 2:30 at night. Anyway, so what I can only do, after all, this conference is called a conference of contemporary times. I want to invite you to look at contemporary times from at least one more possible way of looking at it. And I will provide some clues to it. I don't have the time, nor do I have thought about it to give you the right kind of formulation for them. But what I think are half a dozen crucial elements in the world we live in. There was before that, maybe I can say a few preliminary words about, if not neoliberalism, at least about globalization. I feel more confident talking about it. I do not think the globalization we are facing today is the first globalization. It is the third attempt to globalize. The first attempt to globalize, I believe, was the slave trade, Atlantic slave trade, which was a last vestige of world's most successful genocide ever. 120 million estimated deaths, according to more recent research. Previously, it was thought to be something closer to 3 or 4 million. That gives you an idea of its scale. I mean the discovery of America and the destruction of the native populations. That destruction of native populations led to a shortage of people to work on the newly expanding farms and ranches. And the beginning of a 4-continent trade called slave trade. It was not something that happened only in the United States and it is bit in Africa. It involved also Asia and Europe. Some of the capitals of the slave trade were in Europe. The second such attempt to globalize was colonialism. And I distinguish between the first phase of colonialism, which was coterminous with the slave trade and can be seen as an extension of it, and the second phase of colonization, which was pioneered by England and France. Because this modern colonialism had, in addition to standard hopes of gain from pillage and exploitation, a new element, civilizing mission, the white man's spirit, which we have inherited now. It also coincided with many of our favorite categories and favorite, what you might call new forms of divinity. People often tell me that you don't seem to like anything in the modern world. It is not that. I decided many years ago that I will examine the new divinities of our times. Nation state, which came out in the finalized in the 17th century. The idea of social evolutionism, Darwinian evolutionism, has applied to the non-biological world. Illich once said that it took 2 billion people on earth to learn over 20 years that they were backward. Now we know what we are, that we have learned, that teaching has been successful. I mean, he is right in the sense about the crisis of neoliberalism. If I may point out to it, that doesn't, neoliberalism was never a secure proposition from the beginning, because of all the different forms of capitalism. They did come back, they will do it quickly. Let's wait for a minute, otherwise I will shout and you have to bear with that. Anyway, let me continue. If somebody cannot hear, please tell me that. I will try to speak even louder. And that's a little better. I was talking about the new divinities that included the discovery of the nation state consolidated in the Treaty of Westphalia. You can call it Westphalian nation state. The discovery of the term nationalism. Previously, patriotism was the commonly used word, and even then, Dr. Johnson once said that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel. I don't know what he would have said if he had to face nationalism. And third, the consolidation of Protestant ethics globally. Protestant ethics was, the Weberian thesis might not have been transmitted through our courses, educational courses, but intuitively it was sensed that Protestant ethics and that particular version of Christianity, a masculinized, organized church of a organized in a certain particular way, the separation of the church and the state, separation of religion and public life, these were necessary components of a society to succeed. That was sensed by even all the reform movements which we have seen in India. It is no accident that every religion every major religion has produced something akin to the Protestant ethics version of that same religion. If we have Arya Samaj here, from which a major phalanx of the Hindu national leaders have emerged, and Ramakrishna Mission, from which another phalanx of Hindu nationalism has emerged. In Buddhism, there has been Dhammapala with a Protestant ethics version of Buddhism. In China, Confucianism has a Protestant ethics version. And I do believe, this idea was planted in my mind for the first time by Ernest Gelder. He once asked me, do you know why the sun smiles in the morning? I said, you tell me. He said, because it knows by the evening he will be in the west. everybody wanted to go west. Everybody wanted to go west. And Geldan also told me, he was serious. I was very young then when he told me this. That was in fact my first international meeting. He told me that in the 21st century, I am going to die soon, but you will be living, and you will see gradually the decline of all religions except one, Protestant Christianity. But I don't want to go into that. That will be a digression. I am to come at something more contemporary. So I am suggesting to you that this new kind of sentiment, Protestant ethics, were also a made-up part of the new values which have to be imbibed. Another marker of the backward societies and the advanced societies. You can also call it poor societies and societies trying to be richer through industrial revolution. That also is possible to say. But now we have reached a stage where different kind of vectors have been let loose in our experience. I will give you, could have given 6 or 7 of them, but I will probably try to stop at 3. 1, there was a survey done in the first decade of 20th century of what it was done only in United States, to the best of my knowledge. I have not found a second survey which provides similar comparative data. The survey shows that in the first decade of United States, when the survey was done, it was found that something like a little more than 90% of the human time in a day of an individual, average American individual, more than 90% went into bilateral or multilateral exchanges. You came in touch with other human beings, get your work done through other human beings, and you talked with other human beings, you thought with other human beings, you shared things with other human beings. 10% was unilateral, one-way communication. Like radio, if you switch on the radio, radio goes on, you passively listen. That's one way. This survey was repeated in the 1980s. By that time, the figures have just reversed. More than 90% of all human interrelations were unilateral, univalent you can call it. And only less than 10% was bilateral or multilateral. So there is an abstraction and reification of human relationship themselves. Many of the cruelties you have talked about, many of the brutalizations we see around us, partly comes from the reification. The kind of changing nature of violence which was first noticed in the Second World War, and Arendt, of course, from the first one to write about it, though it was first noticed not by Arendt, but by Rabindranath Tagore. He was going in a plane to Iran, and the plane was being driven by pilots who had participated in the Afghan wars. And they explained to him the beauties of aerial bombing. And it struck Tagore that this distancing of between the killer and the killed, this emotional, psychological, in this case physical also, was a dangerous signal. That it talks about, it seems to promise a dark future in not only in human conflict, but otherwise too. And I would hold it as the first parameter, first, I feel like dimension of the new world we have entered in. The if you look at the nature, you will find that these have been systematically applied. Systematically applied. And the justifications for this kind of new brutalized violence, this dispassionate violence where you don't see your victims, but you know that you have to kill them, it's a bit like the scenes in that movie Apocalypse Now, where the helicopter pilots are bombing a Vietnamese village. You are shown the village where people are running for their lives, many of them injured. Even the chickens and the lambs are running, the domestic animals are running. And when they start the village, and on the up from the helicopter, you don't see these details. They are playing Wagner's The Cry of the Valkyries on the stereo system of the helicopter. And so that's the distance I have in mind. That's the first marker of this age. The second marker of the age is that always human beings have thought in terms of three. The first classification or any measure of timing was past, future, and the present. The past is a domain which came more easily, but in the past was also contained the clues to the future, and future was also thought of. People thought of the future, predicted. You might have, some of them thought of it in very short terms, how our grandchildren's world will be like, some in longer terms. The prophets and the philosophers thought of it that way. But now, for the first time, also because future was also thought about, because the utopias could be placed in the past also. In China, this was definitely the case. In Indian civilization, this was definitely the case. In the Christian realm, this was the case at one time. Garden of Eden was a utopia from which human beings were exiled. So you cannot have futures anymore in the past. But future is real future. But all past and futures have to be constructed at this moment. Standing here, we are talking of the past and the future. And nobody can convince me that the historian's past is the most important past. Because like all human constructions, even history is a human construction. And so is historians' favorite source, the archives. Historians are slaves of archives. And therefore, they are more ignorant of the fact that history is only the partial truth. Large domains of certain civilizations are outside history, either in public memory or different ways, different types of narratives, which are half mythical, half true, but there is at least a record. There are human sentiments, human suffering, the major events in the lives of the communities, and so on and so forth, which give you clues to how they might have looked at the world. Historian actually is giving you what you are thinking of what the past looked like. When Benedetto Croce once said, all history is contemporary history. I think there is a truth in that. And if you look at it, this society particularly, the whole of South Asia, the Al-Hind or Bharatvarsha, Jambudweep, this civilization has always recognized this, and large domains of the civilization are still survive. They still survive outside history. So every community, Adivasis, even the Dalits, have their own way of constructing the past. If you read or hear the Marasyas of the Bhils, when they sing This is suppose a child dies and they sing that the song tells them that how they will, what they should do in next birth. And they sing of why they should not be born as Brahmins, why they should not be born as Kshatriyas, why they should not be born as Vaishyas, they should be only born as a male. Yeah? So every community had its dignity, which is enshrined as that. And because this is a mythic structure, that myth accommodates new inputs into it also. But this is one example, but the other obvious examples are there. The entire musical tradition of India, classical musical system, both of North India and South India, is absolutely aggressively oral. You can get degrees in music. In our university now, more than 50 universities which give you degrees in music. You can do BA, MA, PhD in music. But in the last 70 years, none of the universities has produced one performing artist. Nobody can mention to me one performing artist who has come out of the university and got on the stage. There are apparent exceptions, but I examined them and they are not happened. I mean, I've gone and talked to the artist and they said, no, when I wanted to sing on the stage, I had a guru. And the first principle of learning classical music is this, that even if you are highly literate, and even if your guru is highly literate, you must interact during your training with each other as if both of you are illiterate. And only depend on orality and memory. Orality and memory. So the domain of memory is more. I mean, there's a name for that, Venkatrao, this young English literature man, has coined a term for it, called them mnemonic communities. They are communities primarily surviving on memories. And there are various kind of interesting studies on it. I mean, there's a book called Last Navigator, which gives you a clue how these Pacific Islanders, rich Pacific Islanders, the Pacific is the most notorious ocean for its unpredictability. And how these navigators, with this almost kayak-like boats, manually driven, crossed this notorious sea and populated so many islands. Because they have learned how to reach nature. And this young anthropologist went to do his PhD doctoral work by apprenticing himself to one of the last navigator, a very old man. And he taught him how to read the movement of suns and moons and stars, how to read the shoals of fish moving through the water, how to recognize the different colors of water, how to recognize the leaves floating around, and how to navigate yourself in this, how to read the winds, and so on and so forth. There are hundreds of variables put in a kind of a imaginary multivariate analytic model, and then from it you decide. It was a fantastic training, and I don't think there is anybody else to train. Now he is the last, that young, now no longer young American, probably remains the last trained navigator of the Pacific Ocean before the discovery of sonars and other laser-driven digital mechanisms. Anyway, that. So the loss of the future in this kind of context, the future can be only in the future, and you have to think about the future. The result is this, that future, the thinking about future has diminished dramatically. It is beautifully captured in a comment by a famous American wit, whose name I forget. He was asked, what do you think of the future on some specific context? He says, why should I think of the future? What has the future done for me? I think that is the good way of summarizing the attitude of many. I don't think Mr. Trump's position is any different. And if you think Mr. Trump is an exception and a bit of a fool, then think of the others like that, who will be, will not admit it, but share the same worldview. Let the next generation handle the environmental crisis, and so on and so forth. So there is this part of the story. I consider this the second major dimension of the world we have entered. Third, there is. I hope I will not Tini boken. Faith are beginning of. One result of it is this, that human beings who are immortal beings, one way of denying death, one way of conceiving oneself as immortal is to impute immortality. You live as if you are immortal, and you live as if your institutions and the structures you have built, or the right books you have written, or the paintings you have painted, will make you symbolic important. One person has gone so much as to say that all civilization is built on the death denial. This is the clue to civilization. And in this kind of world, now, in this less faith, this in faithless world, or you can say world of diminished faith, you are looking for new certitudes. Looking for new certitudes. And what can give us certitude better than scientific rationality? Idea of perpetual development, perpetual progress, theory of progress, secularism, because if you don't have a God, you are definite about it. It's a form of certitude that you are there to define it your way. It's a human construction, and believe it to be hope that it gives you the certitude. Not hope, you are convinced that it gives you the certitude. You are lost otherwise. Everybody is looking for an anchor of life. And these anchors they are found in some of the concepts I mentioned. Yeah. So therefore, we build up new kinds of abusive terms, new kind of rejections of this one, which will allow you to sustain these certitudes. So those who are killing the secularists are as devoid of certitudes. Therefore, they want certitudes in faith. They want to hold on to something which they sense, in heart of heart they sense that it is under threat. And therefore these 4 or 5 intellectuals they killed, where they saw as easy targets who were symbolizing that loss of faith. But the other side there is the same kind of certitude. Same kind of certitude, all of us. We are tempted to create that kind of structures of certitude. When John Robinson used to say to his students that the only colonialism is bad, but the only thing worse than colonialism is not being colonized. And the reason for that lies in an exchange between Engels and Marx. When Algeria was colonized, France won the war there, Engels wrote that it has been colonized. And Marx, I think it's Marx who said, or I forget who, I have that in one of my writings, there's reference to it. Good that Algeria has been colonized. It will now join civilization. Anybody who has read any accounts of Africa's past, or Mediterranean past, and any account of French past, we know that Algeria has a civilization of at least 2,000 years, and France has a civilization probably not more than 1,500 years. But they did have the arrogance to say that the Algerians will be civilized by the French. And this idea of civilizing mission, and the justifications are also always in terms of social evolutionism. Exactly as Darwinian evolution in biological world determines survival and the right to survive, in human societies it can be applied in our theories of eugenics and in our way we plan the extinction of people. I don't think very many Indians will view if the next census shows that the Adivasi population has declined in proportion, because those who are fighting the Adivasis are recruited from other Adivasis groups, and they are in any case under threat. They are in such such an utterly pathetic state that I won't be surprised if that next census. But very few will shed tears on that. Nobody will look into this. Anyway, and also, and the levels of suspicion has gone also. I give my favorite example, but I can give you many examples also from the area of science and technology, because that is the strongest citadel of certitude now, scientific rationality. The village astrologer promises to tell your future for 20 rupees, maybe 40, maybe 50. Some of the persons who were killed by the fanatics was also of that kind. They did fight against astrology and things like that. The people who give names, who will certify that the names you have chosen for your forthcoming film is astrologically right or not. Something you have to change, maybe add another K in your name, and possible. So they charge higher. I am told the rate is 50,000 rupees just for astrologically examining the possible title of film, and film's producer and director. They have to charge astrologically 50,000 rupees. That also is seen as superstition. But the last time I saw this data was in the 1980s in some feminist writings. When feminism has not been so vocal at that time. And they were doing better work, I think, somehow. Which showed that the cosmetic bills of American women was larger than the entire budget of all African countries put together. Now, perpetual youth, I would think that it could be classified also as a superstition. But nobody will attack that. If you give time to me, I will only touch one point on this. I have 3-4 points, but only one of them. This massive breakout of brutalization, this massive breakout of brutalization in every sphere of life, not only in India, all over the place. Nobody thought that the kind of way that people going in a picnic would be shot in, it was in Norway, I think. The man who went and shot Norway. No. Nothing like that had it happened in Norway. I was in China when a Chinese worker went to a Chinese school and shot the children. Not as many as were shot in Peshawar. Not Peshawar only, Peshawar, in Pakistan. But I think 76 were dead. This was 125 of them. And young children, mind you, I saw that these are the first such incidents in China. They had read about it in this kind of instances in America. Everybody was talking about it only for days, because I was there then. The brutalization has still not taken place, despite the Civil War and the World War the Chinese had come first. Even despite that, there was enough sensitivity there to see this as a major onslaught. I think now, even in such countries, there are this kind of happenings, and then this kind of new kind of violence has come in, where it is often even the victims. This worker was a victim of because he felt that he didn't have trade union rights, and those rights didn't allow them to protest. This kind of violence never sees the other side of it. In the Nirbhaya killing, the young boy who was the cruelest of the lot, only one newspaper, news magazine actually, did an interview with the boy's mother. I have the issue. I want to, but I can read it in part, it will be hard news. And it suggests, because the interview was done in a great hurry, suggests that this boy was put at work at a very young age, at the age of 18, in some of these dhabas on the highway. And we know, through experiences of other such boys, that there is a lot of sexual exploitation of these children are also involved in this. We know how these boys were treated, how much exploitation went into it, what was the kind of salary they get and so on. So some of these things are known. But nobody looked at this other source of brutalization. Mahmood Manvir has written an interesting book called When Victims Become Killers. I think in this society a very large number of people have been victims and they are waiting to kill. I think it is nice to talk about people, nice to have faith in people, nice to trust the democratic process, but beware, I would suggest, of the future. I think we have allowed this society to reach a point where we do not have even the explanatory variables in mind what to speak of cures for this. Thank you very much.